Muhammad Ali's last meeting with Joe Frazier. 4 decades, their names could never be spoken without emotion. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier. 2 men who didn't just fight each other. They changed boxing forever. Their rivalry wasn't friendly. It wasn't respectful. It was personal, painful, and permanent. They fought 3 wars inside the ring. Fists flew. Blood spilled. Pride shattered. But the real damage didn't come from punches. It came from words. Ali was loud. Ali was sharp. Ali mocked Joe Frazier in front of the world. He called him names. He humiliated him on television. Crowds laughed, but Frazier didn't. Joe Frazier was a proud man. A quiet warrior. And those words cut deeper than any hook or uppercut. When the final bell rang on their last fight, the rivalry didn't end. It followed them for 40 long years. They walked separate paths. No handshakes. No forgiveness. No closure. While fans celebrated history, Joe Frazier carried the pain in silence. And Muhammad Ali, the greatest showman the sport had ever seen, slowly began losing the one thing he could never outrun: time. Ali's voice grew weaker. His hands trembled. Parkinson's disease stole the power from the man who once danced around the ring like poetry. The world watched a legend fade. But somewhere deep inside, there was something heavier than illness. Something Ali had carried for decades. Regret. Then, one day, fate intervened. At a quiet boxing event. No hype, no drama, no screaming crowds. 2 names appeared on the guest list. Muhammad Ali. Joe Frazier. For the first time in 40 years, they would stand face to face. No gloves. No bell. No referee. Just 2 old fighters. And a lifetime of unfinished emotions. No one knew what would happen. Would there be anger? Silence? Or another wound left unhealed? But what happened next was something the boxing world was never prepared for. And when it happened, grown men cried. When time softens even the hardest fists, time has a strange way of changing everything. For Muhammad Ali, time was no longer an opponent he could outdance. Every step was slower. Every movement deliberate. The man who once floated like a butterfly now walked carefully, as if the world itself required caution. Parkinson's disease had taken its toll. His voice, once sharp and fearless, came out in quiet breaths. His hands, once weapons of poetry and destruction, trembled even at rest. But his eyes still carried something powerful. Memory. Ali remembered every fight, every cheer, every insult, and every word he had thrown at Joe Frazier. 4 years, Ali had brushed it off as showmanship, promotion, entertainment, psychological warfare. That's what boxing demanded, he told himself. That's what sold tickets. But as the noise faded and the crowds disappeared, those words grew heavier. Because Joe Frazier had never fought Ali for fame. He fought him for pride. Frazier was the opposite of Ali in every way. Quiet. Grounded. Unshakable. He didn't dance. He didn't boast. He didn't need applause. When Ali called him names in public, Frazier didn't respond. He swallowed it. And he carried it. 4 decades. While Ali became a global icon, Joe Frazier returned home. He ran a small gym. He trained kids who would never be champions. He worked, sweated, and lived simply. But anyone who knew him closely knew the truth. The bitterness never fully left. He once said, "Ali hurt me more with his mouth than with his fists." And those words were never forgotten. Years passed. Then decades. Their names were mentioned together only in documentaries, highlights, and debates. Who was greater? Who really won the rivalry? But no one asked the harder question. What did it cost them? As Ali's health worsened, people around him noticed a change. He spoke less. But when he did, he spoke carefully. He listened more. And sometimes, when Joe Frazier's name came up, he went quiet. Very quiet. It wasn't fear. It was reflection. Ollie knew something the world didn't want to admit. Greatness doesn't erase regret. One evening, before attending a small boxing gathering, Ollie asked a simple question to an aide. Will Joe be there? The room went silent. No one answered immediately, because everyone knew what that question meant. 40 years of unfinished business. 40 years of unspoken words. Joe Frazier had not been eager to see Ollie again. In fact, he had avoided such moments his entire life. To him, forgiveness felt like surrender. But age changes even the strongest men. His body ached. His breathing wasn't what it used to be. And deep inside, there was exhaustion, not of the body, but of the heart. When he heard Ollie might attend the same event, Frazier considered not going. Then he paused. He had won titles. He had survived wars. He had earned respect in the ring. But he had never earned peace. So he went. The venue was modest. No roaring crowds. No flashing lights. Just old fighters, old memories, and quiet respect. Ollie arrived first. He sat quietly in his chair, hands folded, eyes lowered. This was not the Ollie the world remembered. This was a man preparing himself. Moments later, Joe Frazier entered the room. The air changed. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Time seemed to freeze. Two legends. 2 lifetimes of pain. 1 room. They hadn't spoken in 4 decades. Not a word. Not a handshake. And now, they were only steps apart. Ollie slowly looked up. Frazier stopped walking. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything they had been, everything they had lost, everything they had never said, stood silently between them. No cameras rushed in. No words were spoken. Not yet. Because what was about to happen could never be rushed. For a long moment, neither man moved. Muhammad Ali sat still, his hands resting on his knees, trembling slightly. Joe Frazier stood a few steps away, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. 40 years. 40 years of memories, pain, and pride hung in the air between them. The room felt smaller, heavier. People nearby sensed it. Something important was about to happen. They stopped talking. They stopped breathing. Ollie was the first to move. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up from the chair. Every movement took effort now. This was no longer the man who bounced on his toes and taunted the world. This was a man choosing courage of a different kind. Ollie took 1 small step forward. Then another. Joe Frazier didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Ollie, searching his face. Not for the legend, not for the showman, but for the man underneath. Ollie's voice came out soft. Barely more than a whisper. Joe. Just 1 word. And it landed heavier than any punch they had ever thrown. Ollie paused, gathering strength, not in his body, but in his heart. I been thinking about you. A long time. Frazier's expression didn't change. Years of hurt had taught him how to protect himself. Ollie swallowed. I said things I shouldn't have said. The room went completely silent. Ollie looked down for a moment, then back up at Joe. I hurt you. No excuses. No jokes. No performance. Just truth. For a second, Joe Frazier's hands clenched into fists. Memories flooded back. The insults, the ridicule, the laughter of crowds while he stood alone with his pride wounded. His chest rose and fell. He could have turned away. He could have stayed silent. That's what he had done for 40 years. But then something cracked. Frazier exhaled slowly. I carried that pain, he said quietly. Every day. Ollie nodded. I know, he whispered. And I'm sorry. Those words, so simple, so overdue, shattered the tension in the room. Ollie took another step closer. "I was wrong, Joe," he said. "I was young. I was loud. And I didn't understand what my words were doing to you." Tears welled in Ollie's eyes. "I can't fight no more," he continued, voice breaking. "But I didn't want to leave this world without telling you the truth." Joe Frazier looked away for a moment. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. The anger that had fueled him for decades suddenly felt heavy, exhausting. He turned back to Ollie. "You beat me," Frazier said slowly. "But I beat you too." A faint smile appeared on Ollie's face. "Yes, you did." Silence returned, but this time, it was different. Softer. Then Joe Frazier stepped forward. And without saying another word, he wrapped his arms around Muhammad Ali. The room broke. Grown men wiped tears from their eyes. Fighters who had faced violence without fear now struggled to breathe. Two warriors, once enemies, stood holding each other, not as rivals, not as legends, but as men. Ollie rested his head against Frazier's shoulder. His body shook. "I'm glad we did this," Ollie whispered. Frazier nodded. "Me too." There were no cameras rushing in. No applause. Just a quiet moment that felt sacred. After a long embrace, they slowly pulled apart. Joe placed his hand on Ollie's arm. "We gave the world some fights," he said. "But this might be the most important one." Ollie smiled. "Yes, sir." That day, boxing witnessed something rare. Not a knockout. Not a title win. But forgiveness. And in that moment, the fiercest rivalry in sports history finally came to rest. The room stayed quiet long after they let go of each other. No one rushed forward. No one clapped. It felt wrong to break the moment. Muhammad Ali slowly returned to his chair, breathing carefully. Joe Frazier remained standing nearby, his hands resting at his sides, his eyes distant, as if he were finally laying something down he had carried for most of his life. 40 years of anger doesn't disappear instantly. But something had changed. Something heavy had lifted. People later said the air felt different. Lighter, calmer. As if the room itself had been holding its breath for decades and had finally exhaled. Joe Frazier sat down across from Ollie. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. Sometimes, closure doesn't come through conversation. It comes through presence. A quiet understanding. Ollie looked tired, but peaceful. For the first time in years, those close to him noticed something rare. Contentment. He had carried the weight of greatness his entire life. Expectations, fame, history. But that day, he had faced something far more difficult than any opponent. Himself. Joe Frazier, too, felt a shift. For decades, he had been remembered as Ali's rival. The man in the shadow of the louder legend. But in that moment, he reclaimed something that had always been his. Dignity. Strength without bitterness. When the event ended, they left separately. No grand exit, no public speech. Just two old fighters walking back into their lives. But the impact of that meeting traveled fast. Word spread quietly at first. Then everywhere. People didn't talk about punches or rounds. They talked about forgiveness. Former fighters spoke openly about grudges they had held for years. Journalists wrote that the most powerful moment in boxing history didn't happen inside a ring. It happened between two chairs. Not long after, Muhammad Ali's health continued to decline. The world watched with heavy hearts as the greatest of all time grew quieter, frailier. But those closest to him noticed something important. He smiled more. He slept more peacefully. It was as if apologizing to Joe Frazier had given him something medicine never could. Relief. When Joe Frazier later spoke about that meeting, he didn't say much. That was his way. But once, he quietly admitted, "I'm glad we did it before it was too late." Those words carried more meaning than any championship belt. Years later, when both men were gone, fans looked back on their rivalry differently. Not just as a tale of hatred and competition, but as a reminder that pride can last decades, that words can wound deeper than fists, and that time is something no champion ever defeats. Their final meeting taught the world something boxing never intended to teach. You don't win every fight by throwing punches. Some fights require humility. Some require courage of a different kind. And the hardest ones require forgiveness. Ali and Frazier gave the world unforgettable battles. But their greatest legacy wasn't written in scorecards or statistics. It was written in a quiet room, when two old men chose peace over pride. That day, boxing didn't just witness history. It witnessed humanity. Because in the end, legends aren't remembered for how loudly they fought, but for how gracefully they made peace. History often remembers men for what they achieved. Titles, victories, moments frozen in highlight reels. But sometimes, history pauses and remembers men for who they became at the end. After that quiet meeting, Muhammad Ali was never the same, in the best possible way. Those around him noticed it immediately. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried weight. He laughed softly. He listened carefully. It was as if he had finally set something down. 4 years, Ali had been celebrated as the greatest. But greatness came with noise, crowds, cameras, expectations. That day with Joe Frazier gave him silence. And in that silence, there was peace. Ali began attending events with a different presence. No bravado. No showmanship. Just gratitude. When people mentioned Joe Frazier's name, Ali no longer smiled awkwardly or changed the subject. He nodded. With respect. Joe Frazier, on the other hand, carried himself lighter than ever before. Friends noticed the change. The anger that once lived just beneath his calm surface had softened. He still remembered the pain, but it no longer controlled him. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It released him from it. Joe returned to his gym, where young fighters trained under flickering lights and old photographs. Pictures of Ali still hung on the walls. But now they felt different. Not reminders of bitterness. Reminders of history shared. Sometimes, when a student asked about Ali, Joe would pause before answering. And then he would say, "He was a great fighter. But he was also a man." That was enough. As years passed, both legends faded further from public life. Their bodies weakened. Their voices quieted. But their final act, forgiveness, grew louder with time. When Muhammad Ali passed away, the world mourned. Crowds gathered. Tributes poured in. People spoke of speed, charisma, courage. But those who truly understood spoke of something else. Redemption. Joe Frazier, watching from afar, said little. But those close to him said he was deeply moved. Because when Ali left this world, he did not leave with unfinished business. He left having made peace. When Joe Frazier later followed, boxing lost another giant. And suddenly, their rivalry no longer felt bitter. It felt complete. Fans revisited their fights, not with anger, but with appreciation. Two men. Two styles. Two hearts that refused to quit. But now, there was a final chapter that mattered just as much as any round. The chapter where pride bowed to humanity. Their story became more than boxing folklore. It became a lesson passed quietly from generation to generation. That holding on to anger doesn't make you strong. It makes you heavy. That saying, "I'm sorry," is not weakness. It's bravery. And that forgiveness doesn't change the past. But it gives the future room to breathe. Young fighters who never saw Ali float or Frazier charge now learn about them differently. Not just as champions, but as men who learned too late, and then just in time. In a world obsessed with winning, their final moment taught something rare. That the greatest victory comes after the fight is over. When the crowd is gone. When the lights are off. When there is nothing left to prove. Only something left to heal. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier gave the world unforgettable battles. But their last meeting gave the world something greater. Hope. Hope that even the deepest rivalries can end in peace. Hope that even the hardest hearts can soften. Hope that no matter how long you wait, it's never too late to choose humanity. And that is why their final meeting didn't just leave the boxing world in tears. It left it wiser. There is a moment in every life when the noise fades, when trophies stop shining, when applause no longer matters, when the mirror becomes more honest than the crowd. For Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, that moment came not under bright lights, but in quiet reflection. They had spent their lives proving strength. Ali proved it with speed, words, and defiance. Frazier proved it with pressure, silence, and pain tolerance. Both were strong, but neither had been taught how to let go. Boxing rewarded anger. It fed rivalry. It turned personal wounds into public entertainment. And for decades, the world cheered while two men carried scars no referee could see. Their final meeting did something rare. It ended a fight that punches never could. Ali's apology didn't rewrite history. It didn't erase insults or undo hurt. But it did something more powerful. It acknowledged pain. And for Joe Frazier, that mattered more than winning any argument. Recognition is healing. For years, Joe had felt unseen, not as a champion, but as a man affected by words. When Ali finally said, "I hurt you," he gave Joe something he had waited 4 decades for. Validation. And when Joe chose to forgive, he wasn't surrendering. He was choosing freedom. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. People think it's about the other person. It's not. It's about refusing to let yesterday control tomorrow. Joe Frazier had every reason to hold on to anger. No one would have blamed him. But by releasing it, he reclaimed ownership of his life. That is real power. Ali, too, fought his hardest opponent in those final years. Not Parkinson's. Not age. But legacy. He knew the world would remember his victories. But he also knew history remembers character. And in that quiet room, Ali chose how he would be remembered. Not just as the greatest, but as a man who grew. Growth doesn't always happen in youth. Sometimes, it waits until humility arrives. Their story reshaped how people spoke about rivalry. Sports analysts began asking different questions. What happens after the final bell? What happens when the cameras leave? Because for most athletes, that's where the real fight begins. Ali and Frazier showed that closure is not weakness. It is maturity. Their reconciliation didn't make headlines because it was dramatic. It made headlines because it was human. Two aging men acknowledging pain, accepting responsibility, and choosing peace. In a world addicted to conflict, that felt revolutionary. Fans who once took sides began to see the rivalry differently. Not as good versus evil. Not as hero versus villain. But as two flawed men shaped by their era. Their final lesson reached beyond boxing. It spoke to families torn apart by words never taken back. To friendships broken by pride. To relationships frozen in silence. Their story whispered a simple truth. You don't always get another chance. That is why the moment mattered so much. Because it happened just in time. Ali didn't wait until regret turned into silence forever. Joe didn't wait until bitterness became permanent. They met in the narrow space between too late and still possible. That space exists for everyone. But it doesn't stay open forever. Their lives remind us that strength is not proven by domination. It's proven by accountability. And respect is not demanded. It's demonstrated. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier fought 3 legendary battles that will live forever in boxing history. But their final, unseen fight changed something deeper. It changed how we understand greatness. Greatness isn't just how hard you hit. It's how honestly you face your past. And sometimes, the bravest thing a fighter can do is put his hands down. Every fight has a bell. Not just the ones in a ring, but the ones we carry quietly inside us. For Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, that final bell didn't ring under bright lights. It rang softly, almost unnoticed, in a room where two men chose honesty over history. When people look back at their story now, something stands out. It wasn't the brutality of their fights. It wasn't the trash talk or the rival camps. It was the ending. Because endings reveal truth. Ali once said, "Champions aren't made in gyms. They're made from something deep inside." In the end, he lived those words. Not with speed. Not with power. But with humility. Ali left the world having faced himself, and that mattered more than any belt. Joe Frazier, too, left behind more than knockdowns and titles. He left behind dignity. He showed that forgiveness doesn't erase strength. It proves it. For years, fans argued about who won more rounds, who was better, who deserved more respect. But time answered a different question. Who grew? Their final meeting reframed everything. It taught the boxing world, and anyone willing to listen, that rivalry doesn't have to end in bitterness. That pain acknowledged can finally rest. That pride, when held too long, becomes a cage. And that letting go is not losing. It's choosing peace. When future generations study Ali and Frazier, they won't just see punches and scorecards. They'll see two men shaped by their time, by pressure, by expectations, and ultimately by reflection. They'll see that legends are not perfect. They are human. Their last moment together did something rare. It closed a chapter that had been left open for 4 decades. No applause. No headlines screaming for attention. Just a quiet truth. Nothing heals like honesty. In a world that glorifies conflict, their story reminds us that reconciliation is revolutionary. That apology can be louder than insult. That forgiveness can outlast hate. And that sometimes, the most meaningful victories happen after the crowd has gone home. So when you think about Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, remember more than the fights. Remember the courage it took to face the past. Remember the strength it took to say, "I'm sorry." Remember the grace it took to say, "I forgive you." Because that is where legacy truly lives. Not in highlight reels. Not in statues. Not in record books. But in the moments that change hearts. The final bell rang not to declare a winner, but to declare peace. And that is why their last meeting didn't just leave the boxing world in tears. It left it wiser, humbler, and reminded of something we all forget too easily. Life's greatest fights aren't about defeating others. They're about becoming better than who we were yesterday.